have a love language. We have a sex language.
We have a sex language, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Jesus, for sex language. Hallelujah.
So fun.
I want a sex language, Jesus.
Just days before the split, something completely unthinkable happened to Joni Lamb. An event so powerful, it shattered her entire world and forced her to make a decision she'd long avoided. No warning, no buildup, just one moment that changed everything. In this shocking exposé, we dive into that pivotal instant, explore the emotional fallout behind her divorce, and ask, was this the moment that finally broke her? From the outside, everything still looked picture perfect, but behind the scenes, the distance between Joni and Doug was growing a little more every day. It didn't happen suddenly. At first, it was just small things, moments that felt slightly off, conversations that didn't flow the way they used to, long pauses that neither of them knew how to fill. They were still showing up together when needed, still smiling for the cameras, but something underneath the surface had shifted. Even people around them quietly noticed that the warmth they once had seemed dimmer. As time went on, those subtle changes became harder to ignore. They stopped spending as much time together in public, and when they did appear side by side, the energy felt different. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was the opposite. It was quiet, gentle, almost invisible unless you were paying attention. A forced smile here, a distracted look there, two people trying to hold on to something that was slowly slipping through their fingers. Life around them didn't slow down either. Joni was carrying the weight of a massive ministry, a network, a legacy built over years. Doug had his own long-term commitments, responsibilities, and expectations placed on him from his counseling work. They both had full lives before they came together, and blending those worlds proved harder than anyone expected. Instead of becoming easier with time, the pressure only increased. The schedules, the travel, the demands, the constant eyes watching their marriage, it all took a toll. In private, they tried to reconnect, to find that early spark that brought them together. But there were misunderstandings, missed moments, and differences in how they handled stress. Sometimes they simply didn't know how to communicate what they were feeling. Sometimes one needed space while the other needed reassurance. They weren't fighting all the time. In fact, it was the lack of open conflict that made everything more confusing. It was like they were drifting in different directions without ever deciding to. The people closest to them could sense it, even if they didn't know the details. The silence around their relationship grew louder than any rumor. Friends and family hoped they would work through it, but the emotional distance continued to widen. What once felt effortless now required constant effort, and even that wasn't enough to bridge the growing gap. By the time the public began speculating, the distance between them had already been there for a while. It wasn't about one big dramatic event. It was a collection of small, quiet moments that added up over time. Two people trying, hoping, holding on, but slowly, gently drifting apart. From the very beginning, Joni and Doug stepped into their marriage with good intentions, but also with two very different worlds behind them. Each of them had lived a full life long before they ever became a couple, and instead of blending together naturally, those worlds slowly began to push against each other. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. They looked like a strong, united team. They had the smiles, the public confidence, the shared purpose, but behind closed doors, things were much more complicated. Joni was used to carrying enormous responsibility. Daystar wasn't just her job, it was her life, her legacy, and a piece of her late husband she was determined to protect. She had built routines, systems, and expectations that had taken decades to form. She knew how things worked, who she trusted, and what it took to keep everything moving forward. For her, stepping off that path or changing it too quickly felt risky, almost dangerous. She didn't want anything to shake the foundation she and Marcus had built, especially after everything she had already lived through. Doug, on the other hand, came from a world where he was the leader, the counselor, the one people looked to for guidance. He'd spent years building his own ministry, his own reputation, his own way of doing things. When he joined Joni's life, he didn't want to just sit on the sidelines. He wanted to help, to contribute, to be part of something bigger than himself. But the way he envisioned that involvement didn't always match the way Joni saw it. What felt like initiative to him sometimes felt like pressure to her. What felt like caution to her sometimes felt like rejection to him. These differences didn't explode all at once. They grew slowly, quietly, like a shadow moving in the background. At first, the conversations were gentle. Doug would share an idea and Joni wasn't sure how to respond. Joni would protect a decision and Doug would feel left out. Neither was trying to hurt the other. Both were simply trying to find their place, but the emotional friction built up over time. They were two leaders trying to merge two kingdoms, and that is never easy. On top of that, there was the pressure of public life. Every word they said, every decision they made, every tiny interaction between them was watched. Joni lived with that pressure for decades, so she knew how heavy it was.
About the sexual text, what he would do to you, and I don't want to say that.
What text we talked about sex.
I don't tell people. I don't tell people what
we talked
you read
about
out to me.
sex,
And
like
see,
two
and I
adults
won't
would.
know.
But he never sexted me. He never said anything inappropriate. We didn't have sex until we got
can I
married.
finish?
He is known for his integrity.
This is just sexual talk.
When Joni had told me those things, again, shoving
Told
them
you-
down
Told you what things?
about the text he was sending you, and you were happy, and I didn't know how to process it.
What text?
About the sexual text, what he would do to you, and I don't want to say that.
What text? We talked about
I
sex.
don't tell people. I don't tell people
We
what
talked
you read out
about
to me.
sex,
And
like
see,
two
and I
adults
won't
would.
know.
But he never sexted me. He never said anything inappropriate. We didn't have sex until we got
can I
married.
finish?
He is known for his integrity.
This is just sexual talk.
Okay, that's
Is what
not
she's
even
talking
it.
about.
This is not even it, okay? So when she starts telling me about that, I'm keeping it to myself. I'm really starting to get stressed. Things are not sitting well. My body's starting to get really acting up. That's when my panic attacks started happening.
Because I was saying that when you got the text.
When she was reading all this stuff to me. And Rachel and Beck on the other side were, like, what's going on? I'm not telling them not one word about that. Not about that. When Jimmy comes in the picture as the one she trusted, after that, before we all six met with Jimmy Evans, I called Jimmy privately because I didn't want to dishonor her or talk about that in front of her other children. I called Jimmy privately the day before the meeting, and he will attest to this. And I said, hey, this is something I don't know how to process. Can you help me process it? Is this okay?
Doug had experienced public attention in his own field, but stepping into the world of Christian television was a different level entirely. Suddenly, he wasn't just a counselor. He was a public figure in a massive ministry with millions of viewers. His actions were analyzed, his statements were picked apart, and his role was constantly under a microscope. Even when he did nothing wrong, it felt like everything he did mattered too much. That pressure leaked into their home life. When they had disagreements, it wasn't just about the two of them. It felt like the whole world was listening. When they needed privacy, they rarely had enough of it. When they needed time to grow together, they were pulled in opposite directions by work, expectations, and responsibilities. Then there were the unspoken things, the expectations neither fully put into words. Joni hoped Doug would adapt to the rhythm she had been living for years, the rhythm that kept Daystar running smoothly. Doug hoped Joni would trust him enough to let him have more influence, to step into a bigger role, to be more than just a supporting figure. But neither expectation fit perfectly with the other, and neither fully understood how deeply the other felt about it. Eventually, these misaligned hopes turned into moments of disappointment. A conversation that started with good intentions turned into frustration. A suggestion meant to help was misunderstood as criticism. A hesitation meant to protect was interpreted as lack of trust. They wanted to be on the same team, but they were often playing by different rules without realizing it. Friends who spent time with them noticed that the tension wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle. It showed up in pauses, in the way one of them looked down instead of speaking, in the sighs at the end of long days. It was the kind of tension that builds when two people are trying hard, but the harder they try, the more stressed they become. Inside the home, the emotional weight was beginning to show. Joni sometimes felt overwhelmed, stretched thin between grief, responsibility, and the pressure to make this new chapter work. Doug sometimes felt misunderstood, unsure of how to fit into a world that had been established long before he arrived. And because both of them were used to being strong for others, neither knew exactly how to express their own fears without worrying it would make things worse. The more they tried to fix things, the more complicated everything became. Small problems felt bigger because they came with long histories behind them. Simple disagreements carried the weight of unspoken expectations, and gradually, the pressure turned into distance. Their hearts were in the right place. They weren't trying to tear each other down. They just came into the marriage with different maps, different compasses, and different definitions of partnership. With every misunderstanding, the gap between them widened, not because they wanted it to, but because neither knew how to bridge it while carrying so much on their shoulders. By the time the public realized something was wrong, The internal pressure had already shaped their marriage in ways neither of them could ignore. They were two people trying to walk the same road, but the path kept pulling them in different directions. Behind the scenes, the emotional weight in Joni and Doug's marriage began to build long before anyone on the outside knew something was wrong. It didn't start with one big argument or one dramatic moment. It was a slow, steady pressure that crept into their daily lives and settled in the quiet spaces between them. They were both sensitive people, both trying to navigate a complicated new chapter, but even small misunderstandings started to feel heavier than they should have. A lot of the tension came from moments that were never fully talked through. Sometimes Joni would share something personal, hoping for comfort or clarity, but Doug wouldn't always know how to respond. Sometimes Doug would open up about something bothering him, but Joni didn't always know what he needed from her. Their intentions were good, but their timing, their tone, and the way they interpreted each other didn't always match. And the more confused they felt, the more pressure built up inside them. Family dynamics added another layer of stress neither of them were ready for. Joni's children loved their mother deeply, and they were protective of her. So when things in the marriage felt unusual or hard to understand, they noticed it quickly. They didn't always know what was happening, but they could feel when something didn't sit right. That atmosphere created tension, unspoken but very real. Doug sometimes felt isolated because he didn't know how to share what he was feeling, especially when personal matters became mixed with family concerns. And Joni felt torn between wanting to protect her family's peace and wanting to keep her marriage steady. There were also moments when private conversations suddenly became overwhelming. Joni sometimes shared things that were hard to process emotionally, things that required calm and patience. Doug, trying to be understanding, occasionally felt overloaded by what he heard, unsure of how to handle it or whether he should involve anyone else. Instead of talking through those emotions openly, he kept a lot of the stress inside, which only made the pressure grow stronger. The more he tried to carry everything silently, the more it affected him physically and mentally. Sleepless nights, anxiety, moments of confusion, they all began to appear quietly without either of them fully realizing how deeply it was affecting their relationship. And because they didn't want to worry each other or the people around them, they kept most of their problems private. That privacy, instead of helping, created even more emotional distance. Joni didn't know what Doug was struggling with. Doug didn't know how much Joni was holding inside. They were both hurting in their own ways, but they weren't always hurting together. Oi, yes, or. It was like they were in the same house but carrying different storms. Then came the miscommunication, those moments when the words came out wrong, or the silence lasted too long, or something simple suddenly felt complicated. Sometimes Joni would think Doug was upset with her when he was just exhausted. Sometimes Doug thought Joni was pulling away when she was simply overwhelmed by her responsibilities. They weren't fighting, they were misreading each other, and because neither of them wanted to start a conflict, they held their thoughts in even tighter. Little by little, the emotional stress began shaping their daily life. Things that once felt easy, like planning events, sharing time together, or even having casual conversations, felt heavier than before. They still cared for each other, but their connection was buried under layers of confusion and emotional fatigue. And then there were the private tensions that came from trying to balance their public image with their personal struggles. People expected them to be strong, united, steady. Every time they stepped into the spotlight, they had to put on calm faces, even when things inside were far from calm. That pressure only made their private moments more fragile. By the time they were finally alone, the energy to talk things through was often gone. In the end, the emotional stress wasn't about one person being wrong or one person being right. It was about two people caring too much, saying too little, and slowly losing the ability to reach each other through the noise around them. Miscommunication turned into distance. Distance turned into doubt, and doubt turned into tension that neither of them fully knew how to resolve. It was a quiet unraveling, slow, emotional, and painful, not because they didn't care, but because they were struggling to stay connected while trying to hold the rest of their worlds together. The announcement of Joni and Doug's divorce came like a thunderclap to many of their supporters. For years, they had appeared to be a united, faith-driven couple, a story of love after loss and a testament to rebuilding life. They had inspired millions with their dedication to ministry, their public devotion to family, and the image of stability they cultivated together. People believed in them because they seemed unshakable, and the news of their separation shattered that perception almost overnight. For Joni, the divorce was more than the end of a relationship. It was the loss of a chapter she had invested her heart and soul in. She had stepped into a new season of life with hope, believing that she could continue her late husband Marcus's legacy while embracing the possibility of happiness again. Every public appearance, every broadcast, every smile had been carefully measured to convey strength and faith, even when she was feeling fragile inside. Behind the cameras, the weight of disappointment, confusion, and grief was heavy. She had spent years presenting herself as a woman whose life was guided by faith, someone who could withstand any trial with grace. The reality of the divorce tested that image in ways she hadn't anticipated. There was no way to grieve privately without the world watching, no way to cry without someone speculating about the reasons, and no way to process personal heartbreak without it becoming fodder for public conversation. Doug, meanwhile, faced his own struggles. While he had been admired for his work as a counselor and his experience in guiding couples through challenges, his own marriage was suddenly under intense scrutiny. People questioned how someone so experienced in relationships could not maintain his own. His credibility, his judgment, and his public persona were all challenged simultaneously, and he was forced to navigate the court of public opinion alongside his private feelings of loss and frustration. This kind of attention was not what either of them had anticipated when they entered the marriage. They were trying to live a normal life, but nothing about their lives had remained private. The public's reaction was immediate and intense. Social media erupted with opinions, speculations, and commentary. Some were sympathetic, offering prayers and words of encouragement, framing the divorce as an understandable, if sad, part of life. Others were less forgiving, asking questions about choices, timing, and responsibilities, and trying to make sense of what had gone wrong. Every statement, every photo, and even every silence was scrutinized. The people who had looked up to them were now questioning them, not because of any confirmed wrongdoing, but simply because the image they had believed in no longer aligned with reality. Joni had to maintain composure while navigating this flood of attention. In public statements, she spoke carefully, emphasizing her faith, her trust in God's plan, and her continued focus on ministry. She wanted to reassure her supporters that her commitment to her work and to her personal journey had not wavered, even as she wrestled with the pain of ending a marriage. But while her words were measured, the emotional toll was immense. It was one thing to grieve privately. It was another to grieve on a national stage, with every decision and every emotion analyzed for meaning. She could not hide her humanity completely, and every step she took was observed, sometimes sympathetically, sometimes critically. The pressure to remain poised, strong, and faithful, even while feeling broken inside, was relentless. Doug faced similar pressures. Not only was his personal life exposed, but his professional life was under scrutiny. Questions about his judgment, his past decisions, and his role in the marriage made headlines and dominated conversations in circles where he once had unquestioned respect. Even his friends and colleagues were divided, some defending him, others quietly questioning whether there was more to the story. Doug had built his reputation as someone who could guide others through relationship challenges, but now he had to confront the fact that even perception could be damaging. The very expertise that had elevated him in the public eye now felt like a double-edged sword, leaving him vulnerable to criticism, misunderstanding, and assumptions that he may have been unprepared for. Family and close friends felt the ripple effects just as acutely. Joni's children, who had accepted Doug into their lives with varying degrees of comfort, were confronted with a new reality. They had wanted their mother to be happy and believed that this new marriage could be a source of joy, but the separation introduced feelings of confusion, sadness, and even protection. They were forced to navigate their own emotions while witnessing their mother's heartbreak and facing public commentary on the situation. Friends and associates who had worked alongside both Joni and Doug in ministry had to adjust their expectations and manage their own positions in the public narrative. Supporters and observers alike were left questioning what the divorce meant for the future of their joint work, their legacies, and their influence in the Christian community. Even with all the public attention, much of what had led to the divorce remained private. The small, quiet details of miscommunication, differing expectations, and accumulated stress were never meant for public consumption. What outsiders saw as scandal or drama was often simply the natural result of two people attempting to navigate a marriage under extraordinary pressures. They had tried, sometimes successfully, to balance careers, family, ministry, and each other, but the demands were relentless. There were moments of care, attempts at reconciliation, and genuine love, all occurring alongside misunderstandings, frustrations, and emotional fatigue. The divorce was the culmination of these factors, a recognition that sometimes love and effort are not always enough to sustain a partnership, even with the best intentions. Looking forward, both Joni and Doug faced an uncertain path. For Joni, the challenge was to move beyond the grief, maintain her ministry, and continue living a life consistent with her faith, all while processing the end of a deeply personal relationship. For Doug, the road involved navigating his professional reputation, confronting personal disappointment, and deciding how to move forward in a public arena that had been both supportive and critical. For both, the questions of what next were complicated by their public roles and the expectations of a community that had invested emotionally in their story. The uncertainty extended beyond their immediate circumstances. Both had to make choices about their public presence, their continued ministry involvement, and their personal lives. Every decision would be viewed through a lens of scrutiny, whether fair or not. They had to balance transparency with privacy, faith with emotional reality, and the desire to maintain dignity with the need to grieve authentically. Moving forward would require patience, resilience, and a careful negotiation between personal healing and public responsibility. Despite the pain, the heartbreak, and the public fallout, there was a sense of possibility. Divorce, while tragic, can also be a moment of reflection and growth. Both Joni and Doug had an opportunity to learn from the challenges they faced, to strengthen their own sense of self, and to redefine their paths according to their values and priorities. The road ahead might be uncertain, but it was also open to new beginnings, new lessons, and new ways of serving others while taking care of themselves. In the end, the divorce was not just a private matter. It was a public event with emotional, professional, and spiritual ramifications. Yet amid the scrutiny and speculation, it was also a deeply human story about two people navigating loss, change, and the complexities of life under a spotlight. The uncertainty of what comes next is part of that story, and it is a story that continues to unfold with every choice they make and every step they take toward the future.